My name is Kai, and I clean up messes that regular people can't handle. Not the kind with bleach and rubber gloves. The kind that makes the evening news call it a gas leak or electrical fire. The Department of Unusual Incidents hired me 3 years ago. They gave me a badge, a van full of equipment, and 5 rules that have kept me alive longer than most people in this job. Rule 1. Never work alone. Rule 2. Document everything. Rule 3. Contain first, understand later. Rule 4. Don't touch anything with your bare hands. Rule 5. Always leave before sunrise. Simple rules, easy to remember, the kind that stick in your head when everything else goes sideways. My partner is Vale. She's been doing this work for 8 years, which makes her practically ancient in our field. Most agents last 18 months before they transfer to desk jobs or disappear entirely. Vale has scars on her arms that look like bite marks, and she never talks about how she got them. Tuesday started like any other day. Vale picked me up at 6 in the morning, coffee steaming in the cup holders, and handed me a manila folder marked with red tape. "What's the situation?" I asked, flipping through the photographs inside. "Apartment complex in Riverside. Unit 4B. Landlord called yesterday about strange noises. Maintenance guy went to check it out and came back speaking only in numbers." I studied the pictures. The apartment looked normal from the outside. A red brick building with white trim, small balconies, and a parking lot full of dented cars. Nothing screamed supernatural incident. "What kind of numbers?" I asked. "Coordinates, but they don't match any location on Earth." We drove through morning traffic while Vale briefed me on the details. The tenant, a woman named Sarah Mills, had lived in the apartment for 6 months without incident. She worked at a local library and kept to herself. 3 days ago, her neighbors started complaining about humming sounds coming from her unit. Not music or television, just humming, like electrical wires under strain. The landlord, Marcus Webb, had tried calling Sarah several times with no answer. Yesterday morning, he sent his maintenance worker, Pete, to do a welfare check. Pete had his own key and went inside around noon. He came out 20 minutes later speaking only in numbers, long strings of digits that he recited in a calm, steady voice. The landlord called an ambulance, but by the time paramedics arrived, Pete had stopped talking entirely. He just stood in the parking lot, staring at the apartment building and occasionally writing numbers in the dirt with his finger. The hospital ran tests but found nothing physically wrong with Pete. He remained conscious and responsive to basic commands, but he wouldn't speak except to whisper those same coordinates over and over. That's when the landlord called the police. The police called their special consultant. The consultant called us. We parked outside the apartment complex at 7:30. The building looked even more ordinary in person. 3 stories, maybe 30 units total, with a small office near the front entrance. A few residents were heading to work, carrying travel mugs and briefcases like any other Tuesday morning. Vale opened the van's back doors and started pulling out equipment. We always brought the same kit: cameras, audio recorders, containment boxes made from lead-lined steel, and protective gear that looked like hazmat suits but cost 10 times more. "Remember the rules," Vale said as we suited up. The protective gear was thick and awkward, but it had saved our lives more than once. "Always," I replied, checking the seals on my gloves. The landlord met us at the front door. Marcus Webb was a thin man in his 50s with nervous energy and coffee-stained teeth. He kept checking his watch and glancing up at the building like he expected it to explode. "Thank you for coming," he said, shaking our hands. "This whole thing has been a nightmare. I've got residents asking questions and I don't know what to tell them." "Has anyone else gone near the apartment since yesterday?" Vale asked. "No, ma'am. I locked the door and told everyone to stay away. Haven't heard the humming since this morning, though." We followed him inside and up 2 flights of stairs. The hallway smelled like carpet cleaner and old cigarettes. Normal apartment building smells. We stopped outside Unit 4B, and I noticed that the door was slightly warped, like heat had affected the wood. Marcus handed Vale the key. "I'll wait downstairs," he said, already backing toward the stairwell. Vale and I stood outside the door for a moment, listening. No humming, no sounds at all from inside the apartment. Even the usual background noise of a building seemed muted on this floor. "Rule 2, Vale said, turning on her camera. I activated my audio recorder and photographed the door from several angles. The warping was subtle but consistent, as if the entire door had expanded and contracted repeatedly. The paint around the frame was cracked in small, web-like patterns. Vale inserted the key and turned it slowly. The lock clicked, but when she tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't move. "Stuck?" I asked. "No, just..." She applied more pressure, and suddenly the handle turned freely. The door swung open with a soft whoosh, like air escaping from a pressurized container. The apartment beyond was completely dark. Not dim or shadowy, dark in a way that seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. We could see maybe 3 feet inside before the light just stopped, as if it were hitting a wall of black paint. "That's not normal," I said, adjusting my flashlight settings. "Nothing about this job is normal," Vale replied. She took out a chemical light stick, cracked it, and tossed it into the apartment. The green glow disappeared the moment it crossed the threshold. We could hear it hit the floor with a plastic clatter, but we couldn't see it at all. Vale reached into her equipment bag and pulled out something that looked like a small metal detector. She swept it across the doorway, and it immediately started beeping rapidly. "High energy readings," she said, checking the display. "Whatever's in there is generating a lot of power." "Should we call for backup?" I asked. "Rule 1 says we work together. It doesn't say anything about backup." She had a point, but I didn't like it. The longer we stood there, the more convinced I became that something was watching us from inside that apartment. Not a feeling of being observed, more like the certainty that something was paying very close attention to our conversation. Vale took a step toward the doorway, then stopped. "Do you hear that?" I listened carefully. There was a sound coming from inside the apartment, but it wasn't humming. It was more like breathing, but too slow and too deep for human lungs. Each breath lasted about 10 seconds, with a pause between them that felt longer than it actually was. "Rule 3, I said. "Contain first." "Agreed, but we need to see what we're containing." Vale pulled out a small drone equipped with cameras and lights. It was about the size of a paperback book and nearly silent when it flew. She piloted it through the doorway using a tablet controller. The tablet screen showed only darkness for several seconds. Then, gradually, shapes began to appear. The drone's lights were more powerful than our flashlights, and they seemed to push back the darkness just enough to reveal the apartment's layout. The living room looked normal at first glance. Couch, coffee table, television mounted on the wall. But as the drone moved deeper into the space, I noticed that all the furniture was floating about 6 inches off the floor, not suspended by wires or supports, just hanging in the air like gravity had decided to take a break. "Are you getting this?" Vale asked, recording everything. "Every second of it." The drone continued into what appeared to be the kitchen. The cabinets were all open, and their contents were arranged in precise geometric patterns on the countertops. Cans of soup stacked in perfect pyramids. Boxes of cereal lined up by height. Silverware arranged in spirals that hurt to look at directly. But the strangest part was Sarah Mills herself. She was standing in the center of the kitchen, perfectly still, with her back to the drone. She was wearing a blue dress and had shoulder-length brown hair, just like the description the landlord had given us. She looked completely normal except for one thing. She was floating too. Not hovering or suspended, just standing in the air with her feet about a foot off the ground, as motionless as a statue. "Sarah?" Vale called out through the doorway. "Sarah Mills?" The woman in the kitchen didn't respond. She didn't even twitch, but something else did. The breathing sound got louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from Sarah at all. It was coming from the apartment itself, as if the walls were somehow alive and taking deep, slow breaths. The drone's camera began picking up movement in other parts of the apartment. Books were removing themselves from shelves and arranging themselves in neat piles on the floor. Picture frames were rotating slowly on the walls, showing different images every few seconds. Family photos, landscapes, abstract art, then back to family photos. "We need to get her out of there," I said. "Rule 4, Vale reminded me, no bare hands." She was right. We had containment protocols for a reason. But watching Sarah Mills float motionlessly in her kitchen while her apartment reorganized itself around her made every instinct scream that we should just grab her and run. Vale piloted the drone closer to Sarah. On the tablet screen, we could see her face in profile. Her eyes were open and she was breathing normally, but there was something odd about her expression. She looked content, like she was experiencing something wonderful that we couldn't understand. "Sarah," Vale called again. "We're here to help you. Can you hear me?" This time, Sarah did react. She turned her head slowly toward the drone, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She was smiling. Not a forced smile or a crazy smile. A genuine, peaceful smile, like someone who had just figured out the answer to a question that had bothered them for years. She opened her mouth and spoke, but what came out wasn't words. It was numbers. Long strings of coordinates, just like Pete the maintenance worker had been reciting. But Sarah wasn't speaking them in a monotone like Pete. She was singing them, like a lullaby or a hymn. The numbers were beautiful when she sang them. They had rhythm and melody that made perfect sense even though I couldn't understand what they meant. I found myself listening carefully, trying to memorize the sequence. "Kai," Vale said sharply. "Focus." I shook my head and looked away from the tablet screen. My hands were trembling slightly, and I realized I had been holding my breath without knowing it. "We need to contain this situation," Vale said. "Now." She piloted the drone back toward the living room, but something had changed. The furniture wasn't just floating anymore. It was moving in slow, deliberate patterns, like pieces on a game board being repositioned by an invisible player. The couch drifted toward the kitchen. The coffee table rotated clockwise. The television on the wall flickered to life, showing nothing but static at first, then gradually resolving into an image that made no sense at all. It was a view of the apartment complex from above, as if we were looking down from a helicopter. But the angle was wrong somehow. The building looked like it was built on the side of a cliff instead of flat ground, and there were structures around it that didn't exist in reality. Other buildings that curved and twisted in ways that architecture couldn't support. "Turn it off," I said. "It's not connected to anything," Vale replied, checking her equipment readings. "The television isn't plugged in." The image on the screen began to zoom in, showing more details of the distorted landscape around the apartment building. I could see people moving through the streets, but they were walking on walls and ceilings as if up and down were just suggestions. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the aerial view, I could see two figures standing outside Unit 4B. They were wearing protective suits and holding equipment, and one of them was piloting a small drone. The television was showing us, in real time, from an angle that shouldn't exist. "Vale," I said, pointing at the screen. She looked up from her tablet and went very still. On the television, we watched ourselves watching the television. The image began to zoom in further, and I realized with growing alarm that it was going to show us what was inside the protective suits we were wearing. "We need to leave," Vale said, "right now." But as she spoke, Sarah Mills appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. She was still floating, still smiling, and still singing those coordinates in her beautiful voice. She looked directly at us through the apartment doorway, even though that should have been impossible with the darkness between us. "Hello," she said in a perfectly normal voice. "I've been waiting for you." The apartment's breathing sound got louder, and and I felt the floor beneath my feet vibrate with each inhale and exhale. "Rule 5, I said. "We leave before sunrise." "It's 8:30 in the morning," Vale replied. "Then we're already breaking the rules." Sarah Mills took a step forward, still floating in the air, and crossed the threshold into the hallway. The moment her feet touched the carpet outside her apartment, gravity seemed to remember how to work. She dropped the few inches to the floor and stumbled slightly, catching herself against the wall. The beautiful singing stopped. The breathing sounds stopped. Even the humming from the electrical systems in the building seemed to quiet down. Sarah looked around the hallway in confusion, like someone waking up from a deep sleep. Then she saw us in our protective suits and equipment, and her expression changed to fear. "Who are you?" she asked. "What happened to my apartment?" Behind her, through the open doorway, I could see that everything had returned to normal. The furniture was back on the floor where it belonged. The cabinets were closed. The television was dark and silent. But I knew better than to trust appearances. In our line of work, normal was often just another kind of trap. Vale kept her camera running and approached Sarah slowly. "My name is Vale. This is Kai. We're with the Department of Unusual Incidents. You've been reported missing for 3 days." "3 days?" Sarah's voice rose in pitch. "That's not possible. I was just making breakfast this morning." "What's the last thing you remember?" I asked. Sarah pressed her palm against her forehead, thinking. "I woke up early because I couldn't sleep. There was this sound, like music but not music. It was coming from somewhere in my apartment, but I couldn't figure out where." "What did you do?" Vale asked. "I followed it. The sound was loudest in the kitchen, so I went there to investigate. Then..." She paused, frowning. "I can't remember anything after that. Just a feeling like I was somewhere very high up, looking down at everything." I exchanged glances with Vale. The aerial view on the television had been from Sarah's perspective. "We need to get you checked out by medical professionals," Vale said, "and we need to secure your apartment." "Is it safe to go back in?" Sarah asked. "No," I said quickly. "Definitely not." We escorted Sarah downstairs, where the landlord was waiting with obvious relief. Vale called in a medical team while I set up containment barriers around the apartment door. Standard protocol required us to seal off the area until specialists could determine what had caused the incident. But as I worked, I kept thinking about those coordinates Sarah had been singing. They were still stuck in my head like a catchy song, and I found myself humming them under my breath. Vale noticed and grabbed my shoulder. "Stop," she said firmly. I looked at her in confusion. "Stop what?" "You're humming." I realized she was right. The melody was so natural that I hadn't even noticed I was doing it. "The numbers," I said. "They're still in my head." "Mine too. We need to document this and report it immediately." We finished securing the scene and drove Sarah to the hospital for evaluation. She seemed completely normal during the ride, asking reasonable questions about what had happened and expressing appropriate concern about her apartment. But I noticed that she kept looking up at the sky through the van's windows, like she was searching for something. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "I just have this feeling that I'm supposed to be somewhere else, somewhere higher up." The medical team at the hospital found nothing wrong with Sarah Mills. Her blood work was normal. Her brain scans showed no abnormalities, and she passed every psychological evaluation they gave her. After 6 hours of testing, they released her to stay with a friend until her apartment was cleared for occupancy. Vale and I spent the rest of the day writing reports and analyzing the footage from our cameras and drone. The images were clear and detailed, showing everything we had witnessed. But when we tried to enhance the aerial view from the television, the image quality degraded into static. Our supervisor, Director Hayes, reviewed the materials and classified the incident as a Level 3 spatial anomaly. That meant the apartment would remain sealed for at least 30 days while specialists studied the area. "Good work," Hayes told us. Clean extraction, minimal exposure, complete documentation. You followed protocol perfectly. But as we left the office that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something important. The coordinates were still running through my head, and I kept finding myself looking up at the sky the way Sarah had. "Vale," I said as we reached our cars. "Do you think she'll be okay?" "Sarah?" She seemed fine. Whatever happened to her, it doesn't appear to have caused any lasting damage. "That's what worries me," I said. "In our experience, people don't usually come out of supernatural incidents unharmed." Vale nodded thoughtfully. "The 48-hour rule. We'll know more if she stays normal for 2 full days." That night, I went home to my apartment and tried to relax. I made dinner, watched television, and read a book before bed. Normal activities that usually helped me decompress after difficult cases. But I couldn't stop humming those coordinates. They had rhythm and meaning that I couldn't quite understand, like a language I almost spoke but hadn't quite learned. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep and went out onto my balcony. I lived on the 4th floor of a downtown building, and the view usually helped clear my head. As I stood there looking out over the city, I realized that something was different about the landscape. The buildings looked the same, but their arrangement seemed off somehow. Streets that should have been straight appeared to curve. Structures that should have been perpendicular to the ground seemed to lean at slight angles. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. The entire city looked like it was built on the side of a hill that wasn't there. I went back inside and called Vale. "Are you looking outside?" I asked when she answered. "Yeah," she said. "I see it too. This is related to the apartment incident. I know, I've been humming those numbers for hours." We agreed to meet at the office first thing in the morning to report the new development. But as I hung up the phone, I noticed something that made my blood pressure spike. There was a piece of paper on my kitchen counter that hadn't been there before. Written on it, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were the same coordinates Sarah had been singing. Below them, in the same handwriting, was a note. "Tomorrow night. Come alone." I looked around my apartment carefully, checking every room and closet. All the doors and windows were still locked from the inside. There was no sign that anyone had been there. But the note was real, written in blue ink on white paper, and it smelled faintly of ozone like the air after a lightning strike. I put the note in an evidence bag and tried to convince myself that I was just tired and seeing things that weren't there. But as I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning, I could have sworn I heard someone humming those coordinates outside my bedroom window. The sound was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like a lullaby sung by something that had never been human at all. I barely slept that night. Every small sound in my apartment made me sit up and listen. The refrigerator humming, the building settling, cars passing on the street below. Normal sounds that suddenly felt like they might be something else entirely. At 6 in the morning, I gave up and made coffee. The note was still on my kitchen counter, still real, still smelling like ozone. I photographed it from every angle and sealed it in a second evidence bag. Vale called while I was getting dressed. "How's your city looking this morning?" she asked. I went to my window and checked. The buildings were back to normal. Streets ran straight, structures stood perpendicular to the ground, and everything looked exactly the way it should. "Normal," I said. "Yours?" "Same. Whatever happened last night, it's gone now." "I found something," I told her about the note, and she went quiet for a long moment. "Someone was in your apartment," she said finally. "That's not possible. All the locks were secure." Rule 4 exists for a reason, Kai. We don't touch anything with our bare hands because things can touch us back. The thought made my stomach turn. I had been careful during yesterday's investigation, but supernatural incidents had a way of following people home. We'd seen it happen to other agents. "I'm coming to pick you up," Vale said. "We need to report this immediately." 30 minutes later, we were sitting in Director Hayes' office. showing him the note and explaining the visual distortions we'd both experienced. Hayes was a tall man with gray hair and permanent worry lines around his eyes. He'd been running the Department of Unusual Incidents for 15 years, and very little surprised him anymore. But the note made him frown. "You're sure this wasn't in your apartment when you left for work yesterday?" he asked. "Absolutely sure," I said. "And you checked all entry points? Doors, windows, vents, everything, all secure?" Hayes studied the coordinates written on the paper. "These numbers match the ones Sarah Mills and the maintenance worker were reciting?" "Exactly," Vale said. "Same sequence, same order." "Have you run them through our mapping database?" "First thing this morning," I said. "They don't correspond to any location on Earth, but they do follow a mathematical pattern that suggests they might represent coordinates for somewhere else." "Somewhere else, meaning what?" "We don't know yet." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "I'm reassigning you both to desk duty until we figure out what's happening." "Director," Vale said, "we're the primary agents on this case. We know more about the situation than anyone else. Which is exactly why you're being reassigned. If this incident is targeting you personally, I need you away from field operations." I understood his reasoning, but it felt wrong. The note had specifically requested that I come alone, which suggested that whatever was happening needed my participation to continue. Hiding behind a desk wouldn't make the problem go away. "What about Sarah Mills?" I asked. "How is she doing?" "Fine, according to the medical team. She spent the night with her friend and reported no unusual experiences. We have an agent checking on her every few hours." "And Pete, the maintenance worker? Still speaking only in coordinates, but his condition is stable. The hospital is keeping him for observation." Hayes dismissed us with instructions to write detailed reports about the visual distortions in the note. We spent the morning in the documentation department, typing up everything we could remember about the previous night. But around noon, Hayes called us back to his office. "We have a problem," he said. "Sarah Mills is missing." My pen stopped moving across the page. "What do you mean, missing?" "She left her friend's house this morning to run errands. She was supposed to be back by 11. It's now 12:15 and no one has seen her." "Did you check her apartment?" Vale asked. "First place we looked. Still sealed, no signs of entry. But we did find something interesting." Hayes pulled up a photograph on his computer screen. It showed the door to apartment 4B, but something was different. The containment barriers we had placed around the entrance were gone, not cut or removed, simply absent, as if they had never been there at all. "When was this picture taken?" I asked. 20 minutes ago. The agents on site swear the barriers were in place when they arrived this morning." Vale and I exchanged glances. Containment barriers were made from materials specifically designed to hold supernatural phenomena. They didn't just disappear. "Director," I said, "with respect, desk duty isn't going to solve this problem. The incident is escalating, and we're the agents with the most direct experience. You're also the agents who have been personally affected by whatever's happening. Which means we might be the only ones who can understand it." Hayes considered this for several long seconds. "What are you proposing?" "Let us investigate Sarah's disappearance. Full protocols, full backup, but let us work the case. And if you receive another note, or experience more visual distortions, then we document everything and report immediately." Hayes didn't look happy about it, but he nodded. "Full team backup. You don't go anywhere alone, and you check in every hour." We drove back to the apartment complex with 2 additional agents following in a second van. The backup team was armed with equipment we didn't usually see: energy displacement fields, reality anchors, and containment suits that looked like they belonged on a space station. The apartment building looked normal from the outside, but I noticed that several of the residents' cars were missing from the parking lot. The place felt emptier than it had the day before. Marcus Webb, the landlord, met us at the front door again. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. "Any word on Sarah?" he asked. "We're working on it," Vale said. "Have any of your other tenants reported unusual experiences?" "A few people mentioned strange dreams last night, and Mrs. Rodriguez in 2A said her television kept changing channels by itself." "What kind of dreams?" I asked. "Flying dreams mostly. People said they dreamed about being very high up, looking down at the city. The same aerial perspective Sarah had described, and the same viewpoint we'd seen on the television in her apartment." We went upstairs to check the apartment door. The containment barriers were definitely gone, but there was no evidence of how they had been removed. The door itself looked normal, though I noticed the warping in the wood had gotten slightly worse. "Energy readings?" Vale asked one of the backup agents. "Higher than yesterday," he replied, checking his instruments. "Whatever's inside is more active now." Vale and I put on our protective gear while the backup team set up monitoring equipment in the hallway. The plan was simple: enter the apartment, document the current state, look for clues about Sarah's whereabouts, and get out quickly. "Remember the rules," Vale said as we approached the door. "Always," I replied. The key still worked, and the door opened easily this time. The apartment beyond was lit by normal daylight coming through the windows, which was a relief after yesterday's experience with the darkness. But the relief didn't last long. The apartment was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No furniture, no decorations, no personal belongings. The walls were bare, the floors were clean, and even the electrical outlets had been removed. It looked like no one had ever lived there at all. "This isn't right," Vale said, recording everything with her camera. "Yesterday this place was fully furnished." I walked into what had been the kitchen. The cabinets were gone. The refrigerator was gone. Even the sink and stove had been removed, leaving only capped pipes and electrical connections in the walls. But there was something on the floor where Sarah had been floating. A piece of paper, similar to the one I'd found in my apartment. I photographed it in place before picking it up with tweezers. The handwriting was the same, but this note was longer. "The coordinates are not a place. They are a direction. Tonight at midnight, apartment 6C. Come alone, or Sarah Mills will join Pete in speaking only numbers." "We have a direct threat," Vale said, reading over my shoulder. "And a location. Apartment 6C. That's on the 3rd floor, 1 floor up from here." We checked with the backup team about apartment 6C. According to the landlord, it had been vacant for 2 months. The previous tenant, an elderly man named Walter Kim, had moved out suddenly after complaining about strange music coming from the walls. "Same pattern," I said. "Sound complaints, sudden departure, empty apartment." "This thing is spreading through the building," Vale said, "moving from unit to unit." We requested access to apartment 6C and found it in the same condition as 4B, completely empty, as if no one had ever lived there. But the energy readings were even higher, and I could hear something that might have been very quiet humming coming from inside the walls. "We need to evacuate the building," I said. "Agreed. But first, we need to find Sarah." That afternoon, we interviewed every resident we could find. Most of them had experienced strange dreams the night before. A few mentioned seeing someone who looked like Sarah walking through the hallways, but they couldn't remember when or agree on which direction she had been going. Mrs. Rodriguez in 2A was the most helpful. She was a retired nurse with sharp eyes and a good memory. "I saw her around 10 this morning," she said. "She was walking up the stairs toward the 3rd floor, but she looked different." "Different how?" Vale asked. "She was walking about 6 inches off the ground. Just like floating, but still moving forward. And she was humming those numbers again." "Did you try to talk to her?" "I called her name, but she didn't seem to hear me. She just kept walking up the stairs, humming that pretty song." "What time did you say this was?" "Right around 10. I remember because my morning show was just starting." That was 2 hours before Sarah had been reported missing from her friend's house, which meant either Mrs. Rodriguez was mistaken about the time, or Sarah had been in 2 places at once. We spent the rest of the day coordinating the building evacuation and setting up a perimeter around the apartment complex. By 6 in the evening, all the residents had been relocated to a hotel downtown, and our team had the building to ourselves. But as the sun set, the energy readings began to spike dramatically. "Whatever's going to happen," one of the backup agents said, "it's going to happen soon." At 11:30, I made a decision that Vale didn't like. "I'm going in," I said. "Rule 1, she replied firmly. "Never work alone." The note specifically said to come alone. If we both go, Sarah might not be returned safely. And if you go alone, you might end up like Pete, speaking only in coordinates. Then you'll know where I am. The coordinates will tell you. Vale stared at me for a long moment. This is a terrible plan. It's the only plan we have. At midnight, I entered the apartment building alone. The hallways were dark except for emergency lighting, and every small sound seemed amplified. My footsteps on the stairs echoed like drum beats. Apartment 6C was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway that seemed longer than it should have been. As I walked toward it, I could hear the humming getting louder. Not the electrical humming we'd heard before, but the melody Sarah had been singing. The coordinates turned into music. The door to 6C was standing open. Inside, the apartment was not empty like the others had been. Instead, it was furnished with items I recognized from Sarah's original apartment. Her couch, her coffee table, her television. But they were arranged differently, as if someone had been experimenting with the layout. Sarah Mills was standing in the center of the living room, floating about a foot off the ground. She was still wearing the blue dress from yesterday, and she was still smiling that peaceful, content smile. "Hello, Kai," she said in her normal voice. "Thank you for coming." "Hello, Sarah. We've been looking for you." "I know, I'm sorry I had to leave, but I needed to understand what was happening to me." "And do you understand now?" She nodded. "The coordinates aren't a place on Earth. They're directions to a place that exists alongside Earth. Like a room built in the same space as another room, but you can only be in one at a time." "What kind of place?" "A better place. A place where gravity is just a suggestion, where furniture arranges itself, where you can see everything from above and understand how it all fits together." I looked around the apartment. The television was on, showing that same aerial view of the city that we'd seen before. But now I could see that it wasn't actually the city. It was something that looked like the city but followed different rules. "Sarah, we need to get you back to your normal life. Your friends are worried about you." "This is my normal life now," she said. "And it could be yours too. All you have to do is listen to the coordinates. Really listen, and let them show you what they mean." She began to sing the numbers, and they were even more beautiful than I remembered. They had harmony and counterpoint that made mathematical sense in a way that regular music never could. I found myself listening carefully, trying to memorize not just the sequence, but the relationships between the numbers. They told a story about space and dimension, and the way things could exist in multiple states at the same time. "Kai," Vale's voice came through my radio earpiece. "Report your status." I reached for my radio, but my hand stopped halfway there. The coordinates were still running through my head, and they were starting to make sense. I could see the pattern they described, the shape they outlined in space that wasn't quite space. "Sarah," I said, "what happened to Pete?" "Pete is learning to speak the language of the other place. Soon he'll be able to visit there too." "And what happens to people who visit there?" "They become residents. They learn to float and arrange things properly and see the world from the correct perspective." I realized that Sarah was offering me a choice. I could listen to the coordinates until they made complete sense, until I understood the mathematical relationships that would let me step sideways into that other place. Or I could fight the music and try to bring Sarah back to this world. "What about your job at the library?" I asked. Your friends? Your life here? They're still there. I can visit them whenever I want. But this place is so much better, Kai. You can see everything at once. You never have to wonder what's happening elsewhere because you can just look down and watch it all. The television screen zoomed in on the aerial view, showing me standing in apartment 6C talking to Sarah. But the perspective was from directly above, as if the camera was floating against the ceiling. That's when I understood what had been watching us during the investigation. It wasn't something malevolent or predatory. It was Sarah, looking down from that other place, trying to understand why we were there. Sarah, I need you to come back with me. We can figure out how to manage your access to the other place, but you can't abandon this world entirely. Why not? Because other people need you here. Your friends need you. Your co-workers need you. And people like Pete need you to show them how to come back. She stopped singing and looked at me with genuine curiosity. You think Pete wants to come back? I think Pete got lost between the two places. He's speaking coordinates because he's trying to find his way home. Sarah considered this for several seconds. Then she began to descend slowly until her feet touched the floor. You might be right, she said. I hadn't thought about that. Will you come back with me? We can work together to help Pete, and we can research ways for you to visit the other place safely. You promise you won't try to stop me from going there? I promise we'll find a way to make it work. Sarah nodded and walked toward the door. The moment she stepped into the hallway, the humming sound stopped completely. The television went dark. The furniture in the apartment settled to the floor with soft thumps. How do you feel? I asked as we walked toward the stairs. Heavy, she said. But okay, like waking up from a really good dream. Vale met us on the second floor, relief obvious even through her protective gear. Both of you okay? She asked. We're fine, I said. But we have a lot of work to do. Over the next week, we spent hours interviewing Sarah about her experiences in what she called the overlay place. She described it as a version of reality where the laws of physics were more like guidelines, where consciousness could exist in multiple locations simultaneously, and where the relationships between objects and spaces could be perceived directly rather than inferred. More importantly, she was able to teach Pete how to come back. It took 3 days of patient work, with Sarah singing the coordinates in reverse order while Pete listened. Gradually, his recitation of numbers became less mechanical and more musical. Then he began to add words between the numbers. Finally, he stopped reciting coordinates entirely and started speaking normally again. I was lost, he explained to us. I could see both places at the same time, but I couldn't figure out how to choose which one I wanted to be in. What made the difference? Vale asked. Sarah's singing. She showed me how to follow the coordinates backward, like retracing your steps when you're lost in the woods. We developed protocols for managing what Director Hayes classified as dimensional overlay incidents. Sarah agreed to work with us as a consultant, helping other people who got lost between worlds. In exchange, we helped her establish safe methods for visiting the overlay place without abandoning her responsibilities in this world. The apartment building was cleared for occupancy after 2 weeks, though apartment 4B remained sealed as a research site. Sarah moved to a different unit on the first floor, and she reported no further incidents of involuntary floating or television displays. But every Tuesday, she spent an hour in the overlay place, looking down at the city and making sure no one else was lost between worlds. It's like being a lighthouse keeper, she explained to me. Someone needs to watch from up there, just in case. 3 months later, Vale and I were called to investigate reports of strange music coming from a house in the suburbs. We arrived to find a family of 4 sitting in their living room, all of them floating about 6 inches off the ground and humming in perfect harmony. But this time, we knew what to do. Rule 2, Vale said, turning on her camera. Always, I replied, and began recording the coordinates they were singing. Because we had learned that some rules exist to keep us safe, and some rules exist to help us find our way home, when we get lost between worlds. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is listen to the music and figure out what it's trying to tell you.